5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Puck short.
Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of the One Puck Short podcast. Jeff Marek coming up later in the show, joining me to talk about the situation in Flint with the OHL Flint Firebirds. At one point this week didn't have a coach or a roster due to some pretty bizarre goings on there. As I said, Jeff will be joining me a little bit later on to talk about that. But I'd like to start this week talking about an issue which is a hot button topic in the NHL right now. It's the increase in scoring, or a desire to see an increase in scoring. Now, the size of the goals has been discussed, changing the traditional 6x4 frame. A lot of people opposed to that for pretty obvious reasons. I think both historical and in terms of the record books and just the very fabric of the game almost. Another area which has come under increasing scrutiny is the size of goaltender gear. Now, people may remember that a few years ago they did limit the size of goaltenders' pads. They limited the width. And also the height that the top of the pad could go up a goaltender's thigh. Now, that did result in a lot of guys wearing bigger knee pads, so kind of giving with one hand, taking with the other, because it opened up the 5-hole a little more, and the risk of injuries and shots to the knee went up accordingly. So goalies adapted to that, but now the big focus is on chest armour and goalie pants, goalie shorts. And there's some kind of amusing articles being thrown around now. Mark Spector wrote an article on Sportsnet today, basically suggesting that some immobile goalies would be forced out of the game because they'd have to be more athletic with smaller gear, that some others were only in the league because of their gear, that they weren't fairly competing on ability with some of the game's top netminders. They were only there because they filled the space. But I'm struggling to think of an example of a current NHL goaltender who is either too immobile to play in smaller gear or simply not good enough to play in smaller gear. I don't know what Spector's kind of hinted at there. I mean, at one point he talked about slimming down gear, meaning we see more skate saves again. I think in the last 10 years I've maybe seen one skate save, and that was in a British game. That was Joe Watkins, the former Guildford goalie. The style has changed, and this is what seems to be missed in a lot of the arguments where people talk about slimming down gear. A lot of goaltenders who don't mind that they're not opposed to seeing shorts, tapered, call it, or slim slightly. Same with the chest armour. If they tied down the shoulder float slightly or made it contour to the body a little better, nobody's opposed to that, as long as it's not slimmed down to the point where it becomes unsafe. Because, and again, this is something that Mark Spector seems to have ignored, some of those shots, they do sting. I mean, the guy he used in the banner picture, I don't know if it's Spector's choice or somebody at Sportsnet, they used Roberto Luongo as the picture for Spector's story. Luongo suffered a rib injury as a result of being hit by a shot just last season. You couldn't have been any more ironic if they tried, with talking about advances in gear, meaning goalies don't get hurt through puck injuries from being hit by shots. That's not true. They do. There just aren't too many serious injuries, thankfully. And Rick Lundqvist is maybe a recent example because he took, we'll call it a freak shot to the neck. You don't see that many like that. But just the whole argument is massively flawed, because goaltenders now, they are trained like never before. The position has changed so much. The butterfly save has altered the game dramatically, or altered the position dramatically. And you can't unlearn that. Even if they slimmed leg pads so they were narrower still, and maybe they were thinner, because technological advances have happened, and I think possibly they could look into those sort of advancements to make them thinner as well without risking goaltender safety. But these guys are still 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", 6'6", 6'8", all this sort of stuff. One of my favourite quotes came from Mitch Korn when he was still with Nashville. At the time, it was Pekka Rinne and Anders Lindback as the duo in Nashville. So we're talking about nearly 15 feet worth of goaltender. And Mitch Korn said that they're looking for the biggest, most skilled guy they can find. The attitude has changed. They're looking for tall guys now, big goaltenders, not fat goalies who can't skate, not the little guy who could jump around a lot and was quite athletic. Those guys still find a place, but at the top level, where the number of positions is really at its fewest, and opportunities are slimmest, and the pool of talent is really at its deepest. They can literally choose from any goaltender in the world. They will find the biggest guy with the skill, and no amount of slimming gear is going to change that. And the other point of slimming gear is how much more space is that going to open up? If you slim down goalie shorts and chest armor, maybe you slim the gloves a little bit, and maybe the leg pads too, you're not opening up a huge amount more space. And all we'll see is a brief spike in goals. The goal score will go up briefly, but goaltenders will learn to adapt because they are trained better, they are coached better. Teams' defensive systems are coached better. Tactically, they're much more aware now. They will also adapt. You look at the way Mike Condon stepped in for Carey Price. He's been great, but there's a nod to the Canadians' defense in there as well. They've really supported Price and Condon, and you can't ignore that. Players can't unlearn defensive systems. Goalies can't unlearn the butterfly save. And this keeps being ignored. And I wrote about it in April last year when that infamous picture of Ben Bishop and Darren Pang hit the internet. It's not the changes to gear that have fundamentally altered the position. The gear has kind of changed to adapt to the way that the position has changed. The techniques have changed. You watch guys like Billy Smith, then compare him to Yaroslav Halak. So 2 New York Islanders goaltenders, but their style of play could not be more different. And all these little things about shrinking gear being the holy grail of solving the NHL scoring crisis is just bullshit. You're going to open up less than 5% additional space for shooters. And hey, in the NHL, we'll see a spike initially, but as I said, goalies will learn, teams will learn to defend tighter. It's not going to make this massive sweeping change that some people seem to think is going to happen. And this has been on the cards anyway. The NHL talked in the summer about shrinking down shorts and chest armor. And really what we're talking about at the moment is just firming up of those plans. A lot of goaltenders and people around the goaltending community expected this change to come next season anyway. This isn't a revelation. This isn't really news. It's just bringing some really bizarre comments out of the woodwork. I know Greg Ballack of In Goal Magazine said a lot of the people shouting loudest about all this seem to be the people who understand the position the least. But, they could do it maybe in conjunction with someone else. I heard Mike Johnson on the Hockey PDO cast with Dmitry Filipovich yesterday talking about maybe squaring off or slimming the post slightly. So you're still roughly a 6x4, but maybe you add another inch, which guys can utilise. So collectively you might be able to open up some more space, but the options are limited. And I just think the slimming of goalie gear is a red herring. Maybe they didn't go far enough a few years ago when they adjusted the leg pads and limited other things, and now here we are trying to repair that missed opportunity. And I hope it happens. As I said, a lot of goalies don't have a problem with this. As long as their kit keeps them safe, keeps them protected, because you get a lot more shots coming up high these days than you used to, because, again, shooters have adapted and learned to utilize the space up high, because space down low has been taken away by technical changes and by defensive systems changing, and a lot more guys are blocking shots now. It's easier to block a low shot than one coming at your head. Let's be honest about that. So, yeah, this whole thing, it seems to be looking for scapegoats rather than actually tackling some of the issues, and that is that teams are smarter, coaches are smarter, tactics are better, and goalies are better, and they're better trained, they're more agile than ever before. And this idea that some guys are only there because they wear massive kit is just bullshit. One Puck Short is brought to you in association with Eastside Hockey Manager, an in-depth ice hockey management simulation brought to you by Sports Interactive and Sega, developers of the world-famous Football Manager series, coming soon for PC via Steam. Joining me now on the One Puck Short podcast, member of the Sportsnet team, and more importantly, the host of the Junior podcast, especially with relation to what we're talking about today, the OHL Flint Firebirds, hitting the headlines this week in rather unusual circumstances. Welcome, Jeff Marek. What a strange
Hello,
one.
Rob. Yeah, it's a bizarre one. I've been following junior hockey my whole life. In a lot of ways, it's my first hockey love.
before the NHL. I covered it professionally for pretty much all of my professional life in broadcasting. And I can honestly tell you, this has been the most bizarre 48 hours of any junior hockey story I think I've ever had to cover. We've had some nasty junior hockey stories, some despicable junior hockey stories, but never one that's really left us with confusion and questions and wild turns and emotional ups and downs, the likes of which we've seen going back to Sunday in Flint as they beat the Oshawa Generals. So yeah, Rob, it's a long-winded way of saying, dude, this is weird.
It is. For those who somehow missed it, as Jeff mentioned, the Flint Firebirds came back from 3-1 down to beat the Oshawa Generals 4-3. But Coach John Gruden and his entire coaching staff were dismissed after the game. Now, a lot of people seem to suggest this centres around the amount of ice time owner Rolf Nilsson's son Hakan was getting. And basically, Rolf Nilsson wasn't happy and there was some dispute. And Gruden and his staff were dismissed, only for the entire playing roster to march into the office, throw their jerseys on the floor and walk out. Yeah,
it's not unprecedented that a team has walked out. I had to really dig in my brain to find this, but in 1977, the Sioux Greyhounds fired a head coach with a great hockey name, by the way, Rob. Muzz, it's so awesome. Muzz McPherson. Okay, so they fired Muzz and went 2 weeks without a head coach. And Greg Millen, the former NHL goaltender, was on that team. He ended up running practices for the squad. And finally, after 2 weeks without a full-time coach, the entire squad went into a board of directors meeting for the Sioux Greyhounds. That included Craig Hartsburg, Ted Nolan, Greg Millen, and, I grabbed the name of Wayne Gretzky, Rob, and said, we quit and we're done. Unless we get a head coach, you have no team. One of the board members actually stood up and tried to fight a couple of members of the young Sioux Greyhounds at that point, but ultimately they brought in Paul Theriault, and he ended up coaching the squad. So it's not that it's unprecedented; it's just bizarre that we've seen a team go to this length to protect their coach. I mean, John Gruden is an excellent coach. John Gruden was, a decent hockey player. Comes from the USA Hockey program. Good coach, as you can tell, well loved by the kids. And the one thing I think we need to point out here, too, and I've gone out of my way to mention this because this has been such a negative story for Flint. It's been such a negative story for the OHL in a lot of ways. The Flint Firebirds, they run a first-class operation. The owner himself has written checks to spiff the arena, new scoreboard, everything in and around the in-game experience is first class. The dressing room is gorgeous. The Billet families are fantastic. So any misgivings people may have about Flint, Michigan, the city gets sort of assuaged when you see exactly how the kids are treated. The one problem in all of this is, one of the reasons why Rolf Nilsson bought the team is he wants to see his son, Hakan Nilsson, play. And Hakan Nilsson, at 17 years of age, is at best a 5-6 defenseman, probably a 7 defenseman on pretty much every OHL team. Is probably better served being a tier 2 player at this point. But the dynamic between the owner and son is not a unique one. We've seen it before with the Reichels in Windsor and the Folinos in Sudbury. So it's not unique. But to actually make the step to fire the coach because the kid's not getting enough ice time, that's one that is certainly almost without precedent in the OHL.
Yeah, I mean, who would have thought a town associated with Tim Thomas would be known for rebellion, eh?
That's an excellent point. That's right. The first son of Flint, Michigan, right? The greatest product outside of, I guess, Steve Penny played there and we played in his minor league days. The greatest hockey product ever to come out of Flint, Michigan. Good for you. Nice. That is a very hip hockey reference right there, Rob. Good for you.
Gruden's been reinstated now, was it 48 hours later? And team president Costa Papista, I don't know how to pronounce that right, he called it an irresponsible mistake in a statement the team posted on Twitter. But OHL Commissioner Dave Branch is involved. He's obviously been involved in trying to bring the two sides together as a sort of mediator. But the word investigation keeps coming up. Now, as you mentioned, Nilsson's obviously put his hand in his pocket to help the Firebirds cement their place in the OHL. He's not afraid to do that, which some owners kind of shy away from occasionally. Where do Flint go? Are they just going to be on watch for a little while? Because they've got kids who've been drafted and are good prospects. I mean, Vili Sariavi was drafted by the Red Wings this summer. It seems like a really bizarre situation for these kids as well to do such a thing.
It's interesting. I mean, Alex Nedeljkovic, the goaltender who led the charge, up to Costa Papista's office to drop the jerseys off and then got in his car and drove home saying, I'm never playing for this team again. I mean, he's a Carolina Hurricanes prospect. Josh Wesley is a defenseman who's been drafted by the Carolina Hurricanes as well. Then you have a player, like Will Bitton, who I think is a fantastic player, will be drafted in the first round this year, grew up and played his minor hockey in and around the Ottawa area. What do you do if you're Will Bitton? I mean, it's one thing to do it, emotional, heat of the moment. I'm going to go up there, I'm joining the boys, and I'm going to quit. Well, this is your draft year, so you've never been drafted before. You're not property of any team. Do you really want to do this? Like, if you're Serge Paille, his agent, I mean, what kind of advice are you giving to Will Bitton? Because, it's not like the other guys who have already been drafted by NHL teams. This is the year that you need to show. This is the year you need to show scouts. This is the year you need to show NHL teams. Is this really in your best interest? And your question is an interesting one, too, about the team being on watch because, a cynical hockey observer might, or maybe just maybe not cynical, maybe realistic, Rob, observer may look at this and say, well, the Flint Firebirds want to pretend like everything's okay and the situation's been rectified because the coaching staff is back. Whereas someone else may look at this and say, well, hold on a second here. What's really changed? Nothing. Nothing is different. Everybody is back in their same roles. The same dynamic exists. The owner is still the owner. The son is still the son. Is he going to be on the team? How many minutes is he going to play? What's the dynamic between the owner, the general manager, Terry Christensen, who used to, by the way, and here's where you can get conspiratorial about all of this, Rob. Terry Christensen was Håkan Nilsson's head coach in Little Caesars when he played AAA hockey in the Michigan area. So that dynamic has existed for a long time. Now, what's the relationship between the general manager, Terry Christensen, and John Gruden, who have an association going back to USA Hockey? Any hard feelings between John Gruden and the general manager who, when you look at it quite bluntly, didn't have his back in this situation? I mean, in a lot of ways, nothing has changed other than the dynamics of the relationships with all these key people. And I have a hard time believing, knowing how, not just hockey people, but human beings act, that there aren't lingering feelings of resentment, anger, outrage. I mean, you may publicly, sweep it onto the rug and say, yeah, everything's fine. We're just going to go back and focus in on the next game Friday against the Sarnia Sting. But I don't know about you, Rob, but I kind of have a hard time believing that.
Yeah. And as we kind of mentioned, this is the inaugural season for the Flint Firebirds.
So, yeah, that's right. This is season one, folks. This is the maiden voyage of the SS Firebird. And interestingly enough, the whole thing happened on family night, ironically enough.
Yeah.
Where, some season ticket holders get to, go on the ice with some of the kids after the game, big win. That's a lot of fun. And then if you really want to, wrap the poetry up nicely here, their next game is on Friday the 13th against the Sarnia Sting. So, Rob, in a lot of ways, this is kind of the story that just keeps on giving.
Oh, for sure. And you mentioned the internal relationships. As I said, I'm kind of curious to see how things go with Dave Branch here, because obviously he would have signed off for the Firebirds to come into the league. So for that to happen in the first year, it's got to ruffle a few feathers at OHL headquarters.
Here's the thing about that situation. I mean, this team used to be the Plymouth Whalers, owned by Peter Karmanos, who's the owner of the Carolina Hurricanes in the NHL, just to catch your listeners up with things. He owns a successful minor league hockey program as well, minor hockey program, the CompuWare system. So he's been losing money for a lot of years with the Plymouth Whalers. At the same time, has been a wonderful owner, has graduated a lot of players into the NHL through, I shouldn't say players.
Hall of Famer now.
Players. What's that?
Peter Karmanos, Hall of Famer now as well.
As of yesterday, that's correct. I was in the builders category. That's right. And, he's graduated with players and coaches into the NHL. The Plymouth Whalers have been a wonderful organization for the Ontario Hockey League, not just for graduating players, but also as a recruiting team. So kids in that area, kids in the United States can see what the OHL product is and then make their decision based on what they see between Division I NCAA hockey and OHL hockey. And he has been losing money there for a number of years. This was the owner this was his preferred owner that was going to give him the maximum amount for that team. Yeah. And I think the OHL looked at the situation and said, Flint might not be number one on our destination list, but we owe Peter Karmanos a solid year. We owe Peter Karmanos for everything that he's done. We owe him, take the best sale and we can figure out, how things are going to work with the OHL in Flint, Michigan. So there's that issue as well. Now, the other owners signed off on it, certainly true. And the one thing I think that the OHL found particularly attractive was Rolf Nelson's bank account. And it's always good to have as much money. I mean, this guy, his company, does construction for the oil and gas industry, produces marine equipment. I think they actually manufacture submarines, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So this Norwegian gentleman has very, very deep pockets. Yep. And was able to, as I have been told, with one stroke of the pen, renovate the entire arena. Like when he first took over the team, Rolf Nelson, at the first Board of Governors meetings, Dave Branch, the commissioner, has sort of a list. Okay, these are the things you need to do to the arena and to the organization to bring it up to the levels at 2015 that we like to see our franchises at. This, you need a new scoreboard, do something with the seats. You got to fix up the dressing room. Now, normally that would take a junior hockey operator a few years because you just don't have that kind of money. And as I'm told, Rolf Nelson said, "How much is this going to cost? I will write you a check right now." And that's what he did.
And that was the end of that.
And so that's the type of owner that you're dealing with here. So it isn't someone that's always been immersed in quote unquote hockey culture. He's been, he's a traditional businessman who, in a lot of ways, hey, if I don't like someone, don't like what they're doing, I am going to fire that person. And I don't think he took into account what the dynamic of a hockey team is versus a traditional employer-employee type relationship. And that's kind of where he went wrong, and that's why we saw the apology yesterday.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Jeff. It's great to get your insight on it because you follow the OHL and all the Canadian Junior League so closely.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for calling, Rob. It's always a pleasure, my man.
Yeah, no, for sure. Great to have you on again, and hopefully we'll catch up again later in the season.
Chat soon. Hopefully I'll be in England this summer, so let's make sure we get together.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, let me know, and we'll hook up.
Would love it. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Jeff. Take care, buddy.
One. Puck short.
Thanks again to Jeff Marek for joining me today. You can follow him on Twitter at Jeff Marek. Obviously, you can hear him on the podcast semi-regularly throughout the season. It's always great to catch up with Jeff, especially his junior knowledge is so vast. So to be able to speak to him about the situation in Flint was really great because he's got a good handle on who is up and coming in terms of not just prospects, but also guys entering the draft next summer. So thanks again to Jeff. Hall of Fame induction happened last weekend. Chris Pronger, Sergei Fedorov, Phil Housley, Nick Lidstrom were inducted. Angelo Ruggiero also went in, and Bill Hay and Peter Kamanos Jr. were inducted as a builder. Obviously, Jeff and I mentioned Kamanos during the talk about Flint and Plymouth Whalers. I got to say, I grew up as an Avs fan as a kid, so I was kind of contractually obliged to hate Fedorov, but I have to be frank, he's probably one of my top 5 favourite players of all time, so great to see him go in there. Next year, well, who should go in? Eric Lindros and Dave Andrewchuk are at the head of a lot of people's queues. The discussion surrounding Lindros is always quite intense. Obviously, injuries curtailed his career, but then Pavel Bure's in, and he also had an injury-damaged career. Lindros was a Hart Trophy winner, but he also divided a lot of opinions. A lot of stories sort of circulate that he was kind of a jerk during his playing days, and maybe rubbed a few people up the wrong way. Interesting to see how he goes, but for me, one guy who has to go in next year is Paul Kariya. Now, Kariya was a point-per-game player during one of the toughest eras to score in NHL history, and in the dead puck era, as they called it. He was a point-per-game guy on a team which wasn't that great, to be fair. He had Timo Sinani, he had a great line mate, and Steve Ruchin was a serviceable centre, but the Ducks, they weren't a great team for most of Kariya's career. And it's a shame he was hit by those injuries. That Scott Stevens hit is one that's never sat right with me, even in that era when things were a bit more Wild West, were a little bit more physical. That's always been one that's sat very poorly with me. I thought that was a cheap shot on Stevens' behalf, taking out the Ducks' best player at the time, and Kariya was never the same after. And obviously he's spoken out occasionally on this very subject in one of his few sort of public appearances that he does make now. So again, I hope he gets in. I think he deserves it. I would have had him in this year ahead of Housley, but there's obviously other names out there. Mark Recchi, Sergei Makarov's got a great legacy in international hockey. He was a Calder Trophy winner was he 32 when he won it for the Flames? And so he's got a great legacy too. We may see him go in. It's an interesting one. I mean, guys like Chris Osgood, where does Osgood figure? I don't think he's a Hall of Famer. But you look at some of the other guys who've gone in, Dino Ciccarelli, for example, and maybe Osgood is a Hall of Famer on those criteria. So, interesting to see how that one pans out. A few news and notes. Alex Ovechkin tied Fedorov, who just mentioned. as the leading Russian goal scorer on Sunday. He's got 483 goals in 476 games less than it took Fedorov, so that's a pretty impressive achievement from the Capitals captain. Pascal Dupuis, into injury talk. Pascal Dupuis was admitted to hospital last Friday. He was released Monday and participated in practice. Now, he's 36. He missed 66 games plus 5 playoff games last year with a blood clot on his lungs. So it's quite a scare for him. I mean, this is a heart and soul guy, and the Penguins look a different team with him around. He's the kind of guy that seems to bring the best out in his teammates. And he's a useful player still. There's no question about that. He had great chemistry with Crosby. And he's a guy who can play down the lineup if they need him in the bottom six or maybe with Malkin. So that's an interesting one, especially the way the Pens have been a little bit up and down. Malkin and Kessel find a bit of form, but Letang and Crosby still struggling a little bit. So they won't want to put out the lineup for too long. He, as I said, he's a guy who seems to bring the best out in his line mates and his teammates in general. Carey Price also out of the lineup for another week. He's got a lower body injury now. He's sought further assessment outside of Montreal. So what that actually means, nobody's really sure. As we said, it's a lower body injury. Now, does that mean hip? Does that mean knee? Is it ankle? Obviously, a lot of goalies suffer with hip and knee problems through their career. And is that concerning? Well, yeah, obviously. If he's got a hip injury, was he 28 now? He's played quite a few games over the last few years, though, so maybe this is kind of a blessing in disguise for the Canadians. We saw last year with the Rangers, Lundqvist without that neck injury, but he got some rest while he recovered, and Cam Talbot obviously did quite well stepping in to the breach for the Rangers. It gave Lundqvist time to heal properly, come back, and he looked a lot better in the playoffs. He noticeably had more energy, I thought, for the Rangers during that run to the Eastern Conference Final, so maybe we see the same for Carey Price. He's played a lot of hockey over the last couple of years as the Canadians' number one and Team Canada's number one in Sochi. So a bit of time off might not hurt him, especially the way Mike Condon's been playing. He's keeping that train rolling. Montreal have been great out the gate this year. So, as I said, maybe a blessing in disguise, assuming it's not anything majorly serious in terms of knee or hip problems. Or maybe groin problems. And talking to the rest of the guys at InGoal, one thing that came up is when there's hip problems, there's normally groin problems that precede that. We haven't heard too much about any groin issues for Price. So that's possibly another option that's what this is. They want to sort a groin problem out before it becomes a serious issue. But it's one that has the hockey world watching for sure, given the way he's played over the last couple of years. Last news note from the NHL, Nikita Zadorov was reassigned to San Antonio by the Colorado Avalanche. He's not had the best of times since moving to Denver in the summer. He was part of the trade that sent Ryan O'Reilly to Buffalo. But the way the Avs defense is playing, the way they've handled Zadorov and Brendan Gormley, who came over from Arizona in a trade, Stephanie Elliott going the other way to the Coyotes. The way they've handled these two young D-men is odd. The Avs' defensive numbers are among the worst in the league, if not the worst in the league in some categories. I mean, I watched the highlights of their game against Arizona, and this is literally a 5-minute highlight reel. And I don't think a team's defensive plays ever made me cringe so much in one 5-minute highlight reel as the Avs did in that game. And I don't know, maybe they're still trying to get their system down, but I find that hard to believe. Patrick Roy's been coached for his third season. They had all these trouble last year. Maybe Francois Beauchemin isn't the answer they thought he was, and they need to figure something out, because Varlamov's been patchy. Reto Berra's having a great year. I'd love to know what's changed in his game over the summer, because he's been fantastic, but Varlamov's the guy there. If you put him on one of the, let's say, top 10 teams in the NHL, he'd be a superstar in this league, I think. Because now Francois Allaire has put a little bit more structure in his game. He's golden when he's on, but right now he's not on. And that's the big difference from 2 years ago when Patrick Roy's side had that great run, which took them into the playoffs. It was Varlamov was out of this world. Yeah, he was just brilliant that year. And last season he was okay. He was good. But this year he's not played so well. And the Avs, I think, were the only team in the Central with a negative goal difference. So that's not a good place to be in that division, given how well Winnipeg and St. Louis and Chicago and Minnesota and all that are playing, and Nashville. So, yeah, tough times in Colorado. Zadorov, as say, reassigned to San Antonio in the AHL, just 2 assists in 11 games, and he's been a healthy scratch a couple of times as well. I mentioned the Blues quickly. Just one note I wanted to flag up how well Jake Allen's been playing this year. He's a guy who's had some consistency issues before, but he's really impressed me. this season so far. Brian Elliott obviously had a little bit of an injury scare with a head injury against Chicago recently, but Allen has just been superb. As I said, consistency was an issue before, but he's among the best goaltenders in the league right now, and he doesn't get the praise I think he deserves right now. Sure, it may just be a hot streak, but credit where it's due. And again, the same for Frederick Anderson. He's been great all year. Anaheim obviously struggled out of the gate, but Anderson's been pretty good from the get-go, and it annoyed me a little bit listening to Hockey Central the other day that they talked about how well Anderson had played since Anaheim turned it around. Anderson was fine all along. The goaltending was never the issue. I think Khudobin had one bad game, but goaltending wasn't the problem. So give Frederick Anderson some credit, people. He deserves it. One final thing I wanted to talk about, just focusing on British hockey, as most people in the hockey world saw. The recent game between Belfast and Sheffield was postponed due to a rescheduled One Direction concert. Now, it's all played out in public. It's not been particularly pretty. I 100% understand Steelers fans' frustration. It was a double home game for Belfast, Friday and Saturday night. Steelers both nights, and I completely understand the frustrations and difficulties for Steelers fans who plan to travel, because obviously you've got flights or ferry or whatever transport you're going to use to get to Belfast, hotels, game tickets, and I completely sympathise with them. It's very difficult for them, but the problem is at the moment that if I went for a game in Edinburgh, so I bought tickets to watch Edinburgh Capitals, train tickets, a hotel, and I got there and the game was cancelled, I'd get my ticket money back and an apology. So, sorry, the ice plant's done, we can refund your ticket. And I thought what Belfast did, they gave people complimentary tickets to the Saturday game who were affected, and negotiated a lot of discounts and deals with local attractions, the Titanic Experience, local restaurants. And they've also agreed with the league and with the Steelers to compensate each fan who was affected by £100. I think they've done pretty well out of that. Again, I do understand Steelers fans' frustrations. I think their supporters club estimated most fans on average would have been out of pocket by £250, so it doesn't completely reimburse that. But equally, there was a Saturday night game too, so it was only one game cancelled. It's just played out in a very strange way. And I do agree with what a good friend of mine, Neil, he's involved with the Steelers off-ice team, and he's right that what has happened maybe shouldn't be the norm, where teams just say, well, there is a risk that games will be cancelled if there are problems with the ice or the arena or something else, that it should just be, sorry, that's life. But that's a moral standpoint, I think, rather than a business one. Because Bracknell have had ice problems this week. They can't just automatically start refunding people because the ice broke down. That's not their fault. And I don't think, despite the way this is being painted, this is necessarily the Giants' fault. It's not the Giants' fault. I mean, what do? It's One Direction. I think pretty much any arena in the world would probably take One Direction over a hockey bar, maybe the NHL, in places like Montreal and Toronto and Detroit and that sort of thing, where they're going to sell the building out and do more out of hockey than a pop concert. But that's not going to happen here. That's not how it is. And I think the most frustrating part is that no matter what happens, it never seems to be good enough. And the real problem for me now, though, is something that came out about an hour ago, is that Tony Smith, owner of the Sheffield Steelers, and this is the key point, the Elite League chairman, lobbied to have Belfast forfeit the game, forfeit the points, so basically to award the 2 points to Sheffield. That's the Elite League chairman lobbying on behalf of his team for that to happen. That's mind-boggling to me. That can't happen. I'm sorry. I know Tony's trying to look out for the interests of his club and by extension as well with the ticket refunds for Steelers fans, but lobbying for teams to forfeit points because a game had to be rescheduled is rough. But when you're the chairman of the league, wow. I mean, wow, that's crazy. I can't comprehend that. I'm sorry, I just can't. And I hope maybe this is the end of it, and we have another 24 hours of various teacups having to weather various storms, and then we can all move on. But whether that actually happens, I don't know. I think there's going to be a lot of ill will floating around for a while now because of this. But like I said, I do sympathise with the fans affected. It is unfortunately one of those things that happens, and obviously businesses have to sometimes make a business decision rather than what might be a moral one. But the way it's been handled has not been pretty. It's been played out in public in quite an ugly way, unfortunately. And as I said, I hope we can draw a line under it and move on. But it's one of those stories which has unfortunately painted British hockey in a pretty poor light again around the hockey world. We don't very often see feats of skill. Ben O'Connor's penalty shot spread pretty well. Ben Bound's save in the recent game against the Steelers was featured on In Goal magazine, but it's not often British hockey is featured for its skill. Unfortunately, it's incidents like this and Joe Grimaldi throwing his helmet at people, which hit the headlines. And then we wonder why people think British hockey is a bunch of Canadians chasing around a little rubber disc and trying to fight each other all the time. And unfortunately, that is an attitude which prevails. I exchanged some tweets with James Myrtle of the Globe and Mail because he basically suggested that enforcers are disciplined with the NHL and they just come to Britain, which isn't fair. Even guys like Cam Janssen, who, to be fair, I hold my hands up. I expected more trouble with Janssen than he's been fine. He had a fight with Adam Keefe, but other than that, I thought he would be, DOP's number one guy or number one offender this year. He hasn't been at all, and I'll hold my hands up to that. But signing guys like that drew more column inches than Chris Beech's arrival. And that's the thing. And that's the problem we kind of have, is that these guys come here and teams are all too happy to sign them, but it never necessarily translates back that although Bissonnette and Westgarth and co have come here, they've actually come to try and play hockey for maybe the one time in their career they've actually been allowed to try and be a goal scorer, for example. And Bissonnette, I don't think he had a single fight in Cardiff. He was their leading scorer. He played. And you could say this is his level. Fine. Let's not get some delusions of grandeur over what British hockey is. But if he's going to come here and put up a point per game for Cardiff, good for him and good for them. They've got a point per game forward. And teams would kill for a point per game forward like that. But unfortunately, the way the game is portrayed is influenced by these signings. And we do very little to change that. And the few incidents that do extend beyond the confines of the rink are things like this. They're complaining that the game's been recancelled because of a gig. And again, I sympathise with the fans affected, but it's not ideal at all for anyone, teams or fans. But it's such a stink was kicked up. Really, that's what British hockey is about? And as I said, the problem is there's no counter stories to this. You never hear about this remarkable piece of skill by David Clark or Chris Higgins making a brilliant. It spreads around the British hockey scene. I know Chris Higgins assisted it, and there was some mention of it on Puck Daddy. But so I'm not saying it's completely absent. As I said, the Ben O'Connor penalty shot is the most famous example I can think of. But there's just not enough counter stories to make people see the British game for what it is, because it is getting better every year. Despite the infighting, despite some of the flaws, the standard of hockey in Great Britain has improved, but that's not translating to other people, I don't think. There's a lot of people who don't realise that standard is there until maybe they come here or they actually watch a game here. And there's a lot of people who look down their noses on the sport, even within Great Britain, who don't know hockey, who've never been to a British hockey game, who, again, they just think it's a load of Canadians trying to fight each other and chasing a rubber disc. I lost count the amount of times when I said to people, I used to play hockey, even just rec hockey, and the first question was, do you get in many fights? And that's people's opinion or view of ice hockey. And British clubs aren't changing that, and stuff like this doesn't help improve the image of the sport here either. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for listening. That about wraps up for this week. You can follow me on Twitter at RobMcGregor35. You can, of course, find the blog, onepuckshort.wordpress.com. You can like us on Facebook, facebook.com/onepuckshort. You can email the show at onepuckshort@gmail.com if you've got any comments, questions on the NHL or the British game. I'd love to hear from everybody. If you are an iTunes subscriber, if you could think about leaving a review, that would be massively appreciated. And also there is an Amazon affiliate link for those of you doing the Christmas shop, and it's just a little thing to help the show. Really doesn't cost you anything extra, but we get a little kickback from everything you spend, which obviously helps with running costs, hosting costs, things like that. There's also a PayPal donation button on the blog for those of you who wish to donate. Again, as I said last week, it's not going to change what I do. It's just for those who wish to kind of help and support the site and the podcast, just hosting costs, things like that. So thanks again to my guest, Jeff Marek, and thanks again to everybody at home for listening. I'll speak to you all again very soon.